I'm Ezra Wall with WPR in La Crosse, and I'm joined today by Alexander Platt, who's the music director of the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra. Maestro, welcome to WPR.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm just so thrilled to be talking with you. This is just really exciting.
Well, I'm excited too because on April 8th and 12th, WPR Music is going to air the La Crosse Symphony's recent performance of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica. And I've been excited about that for a while. The performance was recorded last November. So to kick off our conversation today, tell me what made you want to bring that work to La Crosse.
Well, actually, there's several reasons, and it's always beautiful when a beautiful program comes together for a multitude of reasons. It was our November concert, which is always either on or near our celebration of Veterans Day. So we've had a broadly American theme to this concert that we've developed over the last 15 years. And obviously, Ludwig van Beethoven was a German Austrian composer, but of course, his third symphony, the Eroica Symphony, has had in the 200 odd years since it was written, has taken on really profound overtones about just human freedom and the quest for for justice and freedom and democracy. And it's an amazing, fascinating history to it, but it really fit perfectly. And the other reason was really well, just broadly kind of professional, in that Beethoven's symphonies, of course, are known and loved the world over and have been for over 200 years now. And Beethoven's Third Symphony, along with, gosh, I guess his Fifth Symphony, Beethoven 5, Beethoven 7, Beethoven 6, the Pastoral, and of course his final symphony, the Choral Symphony, the Ninth Symphony. Those are just pieces that every so often, our audience just is, going to want to hear. But the third reason really was personal, in that this is a piece I have to admit I've struggled with as a conductor over many years. I've been at this conducting game, and this performance was and always will be very special to me because it really consummated my relationship with this piece. I'm not quite sure why. Beethoven, in a certain way, it's very simple. I mean, it's not like conducting, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring or some modern 20th century score, but interpretively, it's very difficult, very challenging, very just profoundly difficult. And I'm just so blessed that it felt like for the first time I'd finally made my peace with the piece. And I'm very proud of the performance that I and the musicians of the LSO were able to give. So it was one of those concerts, one of those programs where kind of everything just came together.
People will have heard about sort of Beethoven's evolution as a composer from his early music, which is very much rooted in sort of traditional classicism, and his latest music, which was firmly into the romanticism that was sweeping Europe at the time. Where does the Third Symphony fall along that spectrum?
Well, it's a really great question, because you could say, as as far as classical music was concerned, the Romantic era literally begins with the opening cracks, those E flat major chords of the Beethoven Eroica Symphony. Beethoven is uh, literally the composer who is he strides over both the classical and romantic eras. The first two symphonies of Beethoven, I mean, it's a slight stretch to say this, but they almost could have been written by his immediate predecessors. Haydn, of course, who wrote those 105 symphonies, who was his teacher, Joseph Haydn, and then of course Mozart, who the person he wanted to study with. The first symphony of Beethoven could have been like a very late symphony of Haydn had he lived a few years longer. The second symphony of Beethoven could have been like a late symphony of Mozart had he lived just a little while longer. But the Third Symphony is something entirely new. And this isn't, we're talking like 1803, 1804. And when you think that, say, the Romantic era in literature in Europe begins, well, that the beginning of that goes all the way back to, well, of all years, 1776, when Goethe, the great German poet and playwright, published his Werther, and that's really the beginning of Romanticism in literature. But it takes it like at this stage of civilization, music is following behind the other arts, and so it's Beethoven in 1803, just again with those slashing E flat chords at the beginning. That's where the Romantic era begins. Literally, that is the moment.
There's a famous story about the original dedication of the piece, the Third Symphony having been dedicated to Napoleon, and Beethoven angrily scratching that out. And I know the artifact of his score exists, and you can see that on it. How much of that legend do we actually know is true, and how much did that? How much is that just sort of fan fiction, maybe?
No, it's basically true. Again, Beethoven kind of sits astride, as I said, the classical era, the classical age, and the Romantic era. He also sits astride the age of Enlightenment and then the age of Revolution. He grows up in this kind of Enlightenment, Vienna, Haydn's pupil, protege. But growing up in Bonn, he actually grew up in, what is now the western what part of Germany, the small, what was when I was a kid the capital of West Germany, the relatively small city of Bonn, which is right next to France. So as a boy growing up in Bonn, he becomes infatuated with the finest ideals of the French Revolution, which of course begins in 1789. And then he moves to Vienna, and he generally behaves himself as a composer in the tradition of his mentors Haydn and Mozart. And however, with the onset of Napoleon Bonaparte, who first declares himself the first consul of France, the first citizen, because France is going to be a republic. Uh, Beethoven is so enamored of Napoleon, who is going to just wipe the slate clean of all the decadent, monarchism of Europe. But then, of course, soon after, Napoleon crowns himself emperor, and France goes into the era what's known as the Empire. And Beethoven is absolutely crushed by this, and he scratched out the dedication to Napoleon, and eventually just dedicated it to Prince Lobkowitz, who was one of his longtime princely, literally benefactors, who would actually be the dedicatee of the late string quartets. So Beethoven, yes, it is basically true. He dedicated it to Napoleon, and then he was crushed when Napoleon kind of, just let down, kind of threw everyone under the bus and just made himself an emperor as well. And ultimately, the symphony is dedicated, as Beethoven wrote, to the memory of a great man. So it's to the ideal of freedom and justice and republican democracy. Uh, it's to that ideal, not to any one man, and that's actually very liberating because it allows the listener to more deeply engage with the Eroica Symphony on a spiritual level. It's not like what we would later call a symphonic poem, like the end of the 19th century, where it's not like a description of a person. It's a description of a set of ideals. And that's actually what puts the Beethoven Eroica on this kind of cosmic plane. It's like why, again, if you can create a great performance of it, it's a piece that never gets stale.
Beethoven, the composition of this symphony came a little bit after, few years after what was later discovered as this letter that Beethoven wrote to his brothers, wherein he like bears his soul about his declining health and his the beginning of his hearing loss, which was affecting him, and all these things. And that document is known as the Heiligenstadt Testament, in case anybody's heard of it or wants to look it up. but that really revealed sort of a darker side of this deep-seated kind of depression that he was working through at the time. How much does that factor into the compositions of this period, which some people call sort of his heroic period?
I actually don't think it does. I mean, the letter to his brothers, which was written just shortly before he sat down to the Eroica, because of course the Heiligenstadt Testament is written when he was writing the Second Symphony, and actually, I think the Beethoven Eroica is actually a great example of how ultimately a composer, ultimately in the ultimate sense, is not writing about himself or herself. Like the great example of this, you may know, like Mozart, who of course was Beethoven's idol. When Mozart was a teenager in Paris, he had heard via letter, via um, express what they had, then was express mail on horseback, that his mother back in Salzburg, his mother had died, and this personally was absolutely crushing to him. But then the next day he sat down and he wrote the Paris Symphony, what we refer to as the Symphony Number 31, which is this beautiful, sunny, radiant symphony in D major. And it's like the ultimate example of, yes, composers are profoundly influenced by what's going on in their lives, but ultimately their music is their music. And that's also something else about what separates classical music from other kinds of music, and that it is on this kind of spiritual plane, which is why I think once people get to know classical music, they tend to love it more and more, especially as they go through life. And I actually, again, I don't want to ruin your afternoon, but I actually think Beethoven's the onset of Beethoven's deafness, which is, in that letter to his brothers, I ultimately think has nothing to do with the Eroica Symphony. I think it's about a human being who is facing the crisis of his time, which is again, I think it was the great poet Lord Byron who described the Romantic Age as the fallacies of hope. Like people were all hoping that with Napoleon, now we were, the log jam would be broken and we would have, kind of justice and freedom for all the peoples of Europe. And then, of course, the dream died and it just went back to being again a set of ideals. And that's again, as I was saying, Beethoven's Eroica, the story with Napoleon is real, but it's not a it's not a symphonic portrait of a man. It's a symphonic portrait about ideals and the hopes that we all have for humanity.
Well, we're talking about Beethoven, so you couldn't possibly ruin my afternoon at all. So,
Oh, good.
there we go. I don't think people are aware of like when a symphony orchestra like the LSO is getting ready for a concert. You have musicians from La Crosse proper, from the greater area, from even beyond, and they're all coming together to create this thing. And you don't have rehearsals like every single week all year long. I don't know if people are aware of how little time all of these professionals get to prepare one concert. Talk about what goes into getting like from the beginning of the first rehearsal to Saturday evening performance. How much time do you get to spend together?
We have 3 evenings of rehearsal together, which could not be more intense. We come together for 3 successive nights. Since I arrived, we rehearse, as they say, in the European manner, and then we have 3-hour rehearsal sessions. So it's very, very intense. And I have a great support system in that I have a great personnel manager who brings all the players together, Colin O'Day. I have a great librarian, John Clear, who makes sure that everyone has their parts physically and online, and everything is prepared and ready to go. I have a great concertmaster, Wes Luke, who makes sure the parts for the string sections are all bowed and all set, and all the markings are in, and also, he's a concertmaster who really thinks a lot about the music before we're going to play it, before we're going to, literally rehearse it. And I've got a great executive director, Eva Marie Restel, and our board of directors who make sure that for the musicians who do not live in La Crosse or near La Crosse, Say if they're from Madison, or we have a few players from the Twin Cities, but mostly our players are from like the Decorah, Iowa to Madison, Wisconsin, this driftless region of ours. If they need to stay in La Crosse for those 4 days, then they can do that in a hotel. So it's a totally professional situation. And once the clock is going for that first rehearsal at 7 o'clock, it's three very intense evenings, and I'm also graced with a great set of musicians great set of instrumental musicians who really, really want to work. They know that, this is not like a lot of orchestras, regional orchestras, where you can kind of, show up and do your time and, play maybe the same, 35 to 40 pieces. We take a lot of, we're a very adventuresome orchestra in terms of our repertoire, but also the fact that I waited 15 years to do the Beethoven Eroica Symphony. It's a very famous piece, and it's a piece most conductors would have done in their first 3 or 4 years, but I really waited because, as I was saying earlier, on a certain level, it's very, very straightforward, but another level, it's incredibly, incredibly hard. And so we just have a very intense experience together, and I'm just so blessed to have musicians who want to experience that intensity.
You talked about the process that you went through to bring this third symphony to fruition. What is that work like for you? Like as an individual musician, what are you doing to approach a work differently as the years go on, or to bring the best version of it forward right now?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, to bring the best possible version of this masterpiece that I can. And with a piece like Beethoven's Eroica, I could spend, an hour, talking about all the great conductors and all the great recordings. So it's a very humbling experience. And, the great American conductor Leonard Slacken once said to me, when I was studying at Aspen in the summer to be a conductor many, many years ago. He just said, being a conductor is very simple. You just have to walk into the room and know the music better than everybody else. And I don't know the music better in that I don't know how to play everyone's instrument, to put it mildly. But I have to walk in there into that rehearsal room and know exactly how every beat of every measure is going to go. And again, you could give a very straightforward, very kind of metronomic performance of the Beethoven third and just have everything in its right place. And you know, uh, what's the great Abraham Lincoln line? You can fool some of the people all of the time, or all the people some of the time. You can kind of get that. That's not difficult at all. But if you really want to interpret it, you really have to spend, as I do, like a couple of weeks just sitting down with the score and figuring out what I'm going to do on every beat of every measure of each of the four movements. And that is a great challenge. And but it's also a great privilege. It's a great privilege to be able to try to interpret and present the Beethoven Eroica. So that's basically what I do. And then again, I've got this great support staff and these great musicians who help me realize those dreams.
Thinking back to this performance, which was last November, so several months ago now, what do you want listeners to be looking out for as they're getting ready to hear this performance on WPR Music in April?
Well, this is, I like to say, kind of an old school performance of the Beethoven Eroica. Again, it's very typically nowadays, the tempos are very fast, and they have often a machine-like quality. But as we all are, I'm thinking a lot about the advent of AI and what that is going to entail for our human race. And in a sense, I feel lucky to be in the knowledge that I don't think anytime soon they're going to be able to replace um, a conductor with a machine. I think um, people want to engage in live performance with live musicians on stage. I don't, I cannot imagine a replacement for that anytime soon. And so This is this is a performance that takes a lot of risks. It's not by the book. It's a very broad interpretation, and it is ultimately a dramatic interpretation. It's an interpretation that sees the symphony as a kind of drama, as a kind of opera, if you will, without words, without singers. And it's a performance in which I literally did think about every beat of every measure. And I'm just so blessed with musicians who were willing to go on that journey with me. And it really is in the 16 years we've been together, it really is one of my most cherished performances with the LSO. I'm just so proud of them.
Well, it was a wonderful performance to see in person, and our listeners will get to experience the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra's performance of Beethoven's Symphony Number 3, the Eroica, on WPR Music and streaming at WPR.org on Wednesday, April 8th at 8 p.m., and again on Sunday, April 12th at 3 p.m. I've been visiting today with Alexander Platt, who's the musical director of the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra. Maestro Platt, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. And you don't have to call me Maestro, but it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Ezra.
Of course. Thanks.